and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. In pursuit of happiness, has the time finally come when we should value qualitative measurements of well-being over indices such as GDP and other government statistics? Can and should we be more focused on what is known as a National Happiness Index? Or does money still make the world go round? To CrossTalk, the Index of Happiness, I'm joined by Mark Anielski in Edmonton. He's an economist and author of The Economics of Happiness, Building Genuine Wealth. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta. In London, we have Sama Abdallah. He is a researcher and data expert at the New Economics Foundation Centre for Wellbeing. And also in London, we have Christopher Snowden. He is a research fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. All right, gentlemen, this is CrossTalk. It means you can jump in anytime you want. Mark, do you believe in an index of happiness? Because we all know what GDP is. We can all follow the stock markets, and we know what financial institutions are doing if they're going up or down. We know about mortgages. We know just about everything you can imagine about the economy, except for maybe if people are happy.
I think we should. I believe we already have the Gallup Well-Being Index in the United States, so we already are setting precedent. I think we need a new accounting system, not simply another index, but an accounting system that actually measures well-being.
Okay, Christopher, what do you think about that? Can you do it? I can measure GDP, but how do you measure happiness?
All you can do really is ask people how happy they feel, generally on a scale of 0 to 10. And people generally say in reasonably wealthy Western societies that they're a 7 or an 8. And this has been the case for many years. So although I think it's quite interesting to do these surveys, from a policy point of view, they have very little relevance and they're very little use.
Okay, Sama, we have 2 points of view here. What do you think? Where do you fall in on that?
Well, for years, economists have talked about and have dreamed about having a way of measuring utility, being able to measure the success of an economy. They had tended to use sort of measures. I mean, we've fallen back on things like GDP because that's something that's easy to measure. We have it on our balance sheet. We can count things. And in the beginning of the 19th century in the beginning of the 20th century and the 19th century as well, they didn't believe that we could measure anything else. Now we've actually started to see that we can do some measures of people, how people feel. At first it might seem like a strange thing to do. It might seem a bit sort of, can we trust people? But actually the data that we've been getting over the last 50 years and particularly over the last sort of 10 years as we start getting more and more actually tells you something meaningful. It does seem to tell you a story that you would expect. It correlates with the things which we know to make us happy. People who are in good relationships are happier. People who are in abject poverty are less happy. People who have lots of friends are happier. People who do lots of activities, have lots of activities in lives are happier, such as volunteering and other things. So it creates a meaningful story which suggests that the data isn't just people saying, well, yeah, I'm okay. It does tell you that something it does tell you differences between countries. I'll give you one example. In the Netherlands, for example, in the latest survey, 2% of people rated themselves as having a very low level of life satisfaction. That's one way of putting it. Whereas in Togo, in sub-Saharan Africa, 81% of people tell you that they are very unhappy. This is a big difference, and it's something that we can take seriously. Okay,
Mark, if I can go back to you in Edmonton, I was looking at some of the surveys and the different reports about well-being and happiness, and it seems to me, and I don't want to be too contrarian right here, but the poorer you are, the happier you are, because that's what it looks like.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, once one has achieved material sufficiency, particularly, let's say, in Bhutan, there's a level of contentment that's achieved. And it seems paradoxical that the lower the GDP per capita in some cases, the higher the degree of happiness. Again, this is seemingly paradoxical, but the basis of a good life, as Aristotle said, and Aquinas, is a sufficiency of material needs, and secondly, virtuous action. So I believe there is an interesting challenge. Can we achieve a degree of well-being and happiness relative to a certain level of GDP? And I've shown that actually I think you can optimize happiness and GDP around $15,000 per capita. So those are the challenges we face as economists. Can we actually create conditions which optimize happiness and GDP so we can have our cake and eat it too, in a sense?
Okay, interesting. Christopher, what do you think about that, and what is the role of the state in all of this? I mean, Sama mentioned a number of things, the number of friends you have, or what kind of relationship you have. I mean, that's just something the state really, well, I certainly hope doesn't have anything to do with, not now and in the future. I mean, how do you make some kind of algorithm for that? Because I couldn't even imagine that.
Well, first of all, it's not true to say that the poorer countries are in any way happier than the rich countries. Within countries, rich people are invariably happier than poor people, and the rich societies around the world are generally happier than poor ones. You will get some countries, such as Bhutan, and some of the Indonesian countries, some of the poorer countries who you might expect not to be quite so happy, are surprisingly happy, and there are various reasons for that. One major variable, for example, is religion. Bhutan's a Buddhist country, I believe, and having a belief in God has been shown in many studies to increase your happiness. But that leads on to your second question. If having friends makes you happy, which it clearly does, if having a religion makes you happy, which it clearly does, what is the policy relevance of this? Can the government introduce some sort of theocracy? Can they somehow force you to have friends, force people to spend time with you? Clearly not. And this is a problem with the happiness studies, is all the factors that improve happiness, either the government can't do anything about them. In the case of, for example, people tend to be happier in sunny weather, or they tend to be happy if they're married. Government can't affect that. Or it won't do anything about them because the government has bigger priorities. So, for example, it might be that we would be happy if we had a huge road building exercise in Britain to get people out of the misery of being stuck in traffic. That's not going to do it. There are any number of priorities such as climate change, the environment, equalities, diversity legislation that will block out any kind of moves that actually might make people happier.
Okay, Sam.
And thirdly...
Okay, go ahead. Keep going. Mm-hmm.
Thirdly, there are the things that the government's already doing. So we know that people who are very ill are unhappy. We know that people who are unemployed are unhappy. But we've known this for many, many years. Like everything else in the happiness economics, it's obvious stuff. And the government has long been pursuing an agenda of creating jobs and of improving the health service. And life expectancy has gone up in Britain by 10 years in the last 50 years. And again, it seems to have had no effect on happiness per se, but does that mean we should abandon it? I would say not.
Okay. Sama, what do you think about that? Because when I think of government, I tend to feel unhappy. Go ahead.
Well, I can think of two counterintuitive examples, or examples that have changed the way we think about things. One is mental health. So mental health until recently has always been considered slightly marginal in the health budget. It's always been given less money than various sort of different aspects of physical health. But in fact, if you look at the impact of different diseases on people's well-being, the mental health has a much bigger impact than many other illnesses. So one of the things you can take, and one of the things that the UK government has done, is started to take more seriously investing in mental health treatment. Giving it a higher priority than it did before. Another example is commuting. Chris mentioned getting stuck in traffic, and that's true actually. One study which asked people to rate how they felt at particular moments, so a bleeper rings off and you have to say how you feel, found that people were least happy, not when they're at work, but actually when they were commuting, when they were on their way to work. Now, one of the lessons that we can draw from this, and there's other studies which have shown that people who have a longer commute have a lower level of life satisfaction on average, controlling for all other things like sort of income and those sort of things. So one lesson that we can learn from that is that people sometimes perhaps mistakenly think that, if I get this job which will pay a higher salary and I travel further, or if I buy a house further out of town which will be a bigger house but I'll have to commute further to get to work, people often think that will bring them more happiness when in fact it doesn't. So that's actually an individual thing. Perhaps that's something individuals need to be able to learn. I think that's exactly what I would get at. Mark, if I can go back to you in Edmonton, I mean, happiness is just how each individual defines it. I mean, you could have two people in exactly the same circumstances, and one could be happy and one could be unhappy. And I like this idea of an indice, because all of these other indices are for the state and for financial institutions and for people that make money, not for everybody else. The 99% is forgotten in most indices. I want to believe in this, but it seems to me that even if you have two people in the same circumstances, you could have very different outcomes.
Let me just suggest, I'm also an accountant, so my interest is in helping governments be wiser managers of what I might call a well-being balance sheet. Right now, we're operating the economies without a balance sheet. We use an income statement called the GDP, but really there's no kind of accounting for the assets, the human, the social, and natural capital, that actually underpin well-being. So that's what I'm arguing for and working with governments, particularly local governments, and showing how the chief financial officer can start to look at investment in well-being assets. We know the detractors to well-being. We know the things that create better conditions for well-being. So let us invest in the asset classes that actually give the best opportunity for well-being and the fair distribution of well-being across the community. The idea of, the issue of subjective happiness and my perception of happiness, which changes day to day, I'm not totally convinced that's of particular relevance to policymakers. I mean, it's interesting to maybe have the conversation across the fence. And my neighbor gave me a T-shirt that said "Happiness is overrated." So this idea of subjective happiness is a moving target. But let me say, there's a difference between, I think, happiness and well-being, and that's what the conversation in New York was about. The word wealth in the Old English means the conditions of well-being. So what I'm arguing for is a genuine wealth accounting system, so that the wealth and the well-being conditions are connected somehow with what we value about why we love our communities, whether you're living in Edmonton or London or Moscow. And that should be the basis of our accounting system and our reporting back to citizens about how we're doing in terms of the investment of taxes, etc., in those wealth accounts.
Okay, on that note, gentlemen, we're going to go to a break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on valuing well-being. Stay on RT.
Dear Mom, I'm sorry that I had to do this. I've been in so much pain in the past year that I can't take it anymore. The stomach and chest pains have been getting worse, and no doctor has been able to help me. Please know that I'll finally be at peace and with no more pain. I wish I could have had a life with Elizabeth. I always pictured her being my wife and mother to my kids. I love you all. See you all in heaven when your time comes. I'm going to meet Jesus Christ.
Thousands of U.S. troops in Iraq received one of these drugs, a drug called Lariam, and it may have prevented many soldiers from getting sick. The question tonight is whether or not soldiers were adequately warned about its rare side effects, serious, life-changing side effects.
Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand. RT's live broadcasts. And RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com.
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're talking about how to value happiness. Okay, Christopher, I'd like to go back to you in London, and we've talked about individuals and we've talked about governments here. But when we talk about happiness and consumption for most of all of our lives, consumption has been the key factor here. And consumption and capitalism have almost everything together. Is this something the capitalist ruling class was interested in? They just want people to buy stuff. Okay, they're not particularly happy if they're worried about if you're happy about it later or not. Okay, if we look at the debt crisis of the last decade, they didn't worry about our well-being. They just wanted us to keep borrowing. So, my point is, what is the role of capitalism in the economy in all of this?
Well, people pursue their happiness, regardless of whether they pursue economic growth or whether they pursue wealth. People primarily and instinctively pursue happiness. And they can do that in one of two ways. They can, or both ways. They can vote. They can vote for the politician who they think will make them most happy, and they can go out and buy things. And going out and buying things, pursuing wealth, trying to get a better job, increasing your salary, is not some narrow, obscure objective that we've been focusing on too much in society. It's incredibly broad. It's the broadest possible aim that you can have, because money is just a token with which you can do anything. If you want to go out and buy fine food, or go on holiday, or stop working, or retire early, you will need money to do it. So it's a very broad and sensible objective to pursue wealth for yourself. Of course, it shouldn't be your only objective, and if it is your only objective, you'll be very unhappy. And I'm not going to argue that sometimes there's a market failure. There is buyer's remorse. People sometimes buy things and they later find out that it didn't bring them as much pleasure as they thought it would. But there is also government failure, and most people don't get the government they vote for. This is just a simple fact. In Britain, at the moment, we have a government that nobody voted for. So government failure is more serious and has more knock-on effects on everybody than somebody going out and buying something that they later don't really want and end up selling on the second-hand market. And I find it odd that, insofar as consumerism is a problem, that more government is the answer, because there'll be more government failure.
Okay, Sam, if I
think it's very sad to say.
Go ahead, Sam. Jump in. Go ahead. Jump in.
Yeah, I think it's very sad to say that the only way for people to achieve their happiness is either by voting for the right people or by consuming things. I mean, there's many ways that you can. There are many things that you cannot buy. In fact, you cannot buy love. I mean, it's a bit of a cheesy thing to say, but it's true. You cannot buy love. You cannot buy meaning. You cannot buy a sense of self-worth. People try and do this, and they think they can buy these things, and because lots of adverts tell them that they can buy these things, and if adverts tell them that if they wear certain clothes or buy a particular car or whatever, then they're more likely to get love or self-worth. But actually, as we know, this sort of short-term feeling that they get, this little buzz they get when they do buy something, is quite short-lasting. And what people, the way that people actually can achieve those things that they want, meaning, kind of good relationships, etc., is actually through doing things. And one of the problems with the focus on GDP and focus on earning as much as possible is it takes away time from doing those other things directly. So we spend our time working so that we can get all these other things that we desire, when actually we could just get them directly by actually doing something.
Okay, Mark, if I can go to you.
I
go ahead, Christopher first. Christopher, go first. Go ahead.
Well, I do agree with you, but as a political economist, I was looking at it from measurable outcomes. There's the politics and there's the economics. Of course, people pursue love and friendship and all these things that are free, and they're, at the end of the day, probably the most important thing. But money does provide freedom, and it does provide a certain degree of happiness. You will need to put food on the table at some point. Now, how you divide your time up afterwards is entirely up to you, but you do have the freedom to go out and get a part-time job. Your work-life balance is entirely a matter for you, and it's clearly going to be different for a 23-year-old city trader than it is for a 50-year-old mother of four. But that's for the individual to decide, and not the government.
Okay, Mark, if I go to you...
Sadly, that's the problem.
Okay, let me go to Mark in Edmonton. I mean, I kind of want to go on the side of Christopher here. I mean, people do accumulate wealth so they can do what they want to do, okay? That's why people do it. Maybe there's certainly people, and I've met them. I was in investment banking, money for money's sake. But I don't tend to think that they are the majority. I think most people, they want to accumulate some kind of wealth and security so they can do what they want, all the things that we've talked about on this program.
I agree. I think having a certain stock of financial capital so that you can pursue happiness and relationships and meaningful work, I think I try to live that in my own life. Let me raise the bar a little bit and say that one of the proposals I made in New York, which was never discussed, was the connection of well-being to monetary policy. In other words, instead of money being debt, as it currently is, and we have an international debt crisis, we connect the creation of money to these well-being accounts. That's a radical idea, but it's not within the realm of possibilities. We can attach the creation of money to anything we want, whether it's debt or seashells, and my premise, and tally sticks in the UK experience. So my proposal is that we rethink the entire monetary policy structure of the world, that we look at the creation of money in parallel with well-being conditions, so we're actually investing in the real assets that we're going to sustain the possibility for a good life for everybody. Okay, Mark, can you give us one example of what you mean by that? Because that's really deep. Go ahead. One example, for example, I've just said that the nations run without a balance sheet. Most Coca-Cola couldn't run without a balance sheet. And I'm saying that if the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the Bank of Canada had some type of asset accounts of you know, the infrastructure, the bridges and the hospitals, the health of our forests and wetlands, perhaps some proxies for the degree of trust and relational capital in society, we could actually intentionally attach the creation of money, the production of bonds or credit. The private banking sector would also be involved here. I think this is a really exciting new frontier, and I think it's possible. I don't think this is dreaming in color. I think in our history, Abraham Lincoln basically said as much before he died, that the government can create sufficiency of liquidity to what? To facilitate the well-being of the people of the United States. So I think it is incumbent on us as part of this conversation to think about the role of money and how we can reinvent the creation of money.
Okay, Christopher, what do you think about that? Because a lot of people would say, in light of what we just heard from Mark, is that, it's still the market is the best mechanism to decide on the distribution of investment into an economy. Would you still do that in light of the conversation we've had about well-being and happiness?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean the prices and values have to be decided by the market. I would be very wary.
But the market hasn't done very well. But Christopher, the market hasn't done very well recently, and for actually quite a few years for quite a few people.
Yeah, indeed, but there's no reason to think that some sort of top-down government control would do any better. I mean, we need to we seem to have moved on from general well-being science, which is fairly hazy, to blaming the whole of capitalism on the events of recent years, which is really just an issue with one section of the banking system.
Okay, I mean, Mark, do you want to jump in there? I obviously have the impression you disagree. Go ahead, Mark.
Let me say, as a new and genuine capitalist, I think we're actually leaving a lot of profit on the table. There's many assets, invisible asset classes like goodwill and trust and relational capital that are the hallmark of the new companies, the new economy. And I think that capital markets can play a role. Accountants need to, first of all, be able to account for these assets as legitimate and realize their real value. Increase the relational capital we have in society. So I think markets and the capitalism large is in line for a completely new retrofit, and I think not to throw it out. In fact, to marry this well-being piece and aspirations to, in fact, a new kind of capitalism that I think is more enlightened.
Okay, Simon, what do you think about that? A new form of capitalism that takes into consideration wellness and happiness. I mean, that sounds nice.
Well, I think the key currency, and one that we haven't talked about so far, apart from well-being and your usual everyday dollars and pounds, is our environmental resources. And this is one thing. This is one reason why it does make sense. Perhaps if we were living 100, 200 years ago, I might have said, "Oh, government doesn't have a role. It's not in well-being. It's not, it's not necessary for government to be interfering. But at the moment, we have a situation where our environmental resources are getting more and more constrained. There'll be 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. The planet isn't getting any bigger. The amount of resources we're having is in fact getting less. And we do need to start thinking a little bit more seriously about whether we have enough resources to achieve the kind of quality of life that some people at least have been enjoying in the beginning of this century and the last century. And the evidence suggests that we don't have enough. And that's one of the reasons why we do have to start thinking about the well-being data a bit more seriously, because we have to actually start thinking, well, there's a lot of people here who are consuming a lot of resources. So, for example, in the last ecological footprint analysis, Americans consume, let's say, 4 planets worth. If everyone in the world consumed like people in America, then we would need 4 planets to sustain that level of consumption, which we don't have that. And yet, they only achieve, in terms of well-being, in terms of life satisfaction, life expectancy, they achieve lower life expectancy, lower life satisfaction than a country like Costa Rica, which consumes 1/4 of the resources. So that brings you another dimension of efficiency. So if there are some things that some countries are doing which is inefficient in terms of converting the environmental resources into well-being, that's something that those countries need to be looking at.
Okay, Christopher, so let me pose it this way in light of what Sama just said. So Britons and Americans should consume a lot less, okay? Let's cut it in half. Let's cut out 75% of it. Are they going to be happier people?
I would very much doubt it.
I doubt it,
people
too.
pursue happiness, and the people expect to have a better lifestyle than their parents did, and we've been expecting that for several centuries, thanks to consumer capitalism making that possible. And what we're seeing here today in this discussion, it summarises what's wrong with the well-being agenda. It just means that anybody's pet projects can be tied in with this very, very hazy, loose bunch of evidence that doesn't really tell you anything apart from the obvious. And rather than going through the revealed preferences of what people actually want in terms of their voting patterns and their consumption patterns, we just bring in any old ideas which people would neither vote for nor purchase. And the New Economics Foundation, for example, wants us to have a steady state economy. They want the economy effectively to be flat or in a state of recession or near recession. I think it's very unlikely that such an economy would make people happy. In fact, I think it would make people extremely miserable.
All right, gentlemen. You know what is it? The economics is called the science of doom. Okay. Many thanks to my guests today in Edmonton and London. Thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.